Welcome to week 11 of HOS 121. And this week we're looking at psychosocial development in middle adulthood, which is the period of life from about age 40 to retirement around age 65. And in this first lecture, we'll look at changing priorities in middle adulthood. First, we'll talk about Erikson's stage for middle adulthood and the concept of generativity and how that plays a role in people's lives in middle adulthood. And then we'll talk about the idea of midlife crisis, if that's a myth or reality. And finally, talk about midlife as a time of gains and losses. And this lecture draws a little bit on week 5, as well as the reading from week 11. Many adults in middle adulthood experience a shift in priorities. Erikson argued that this shift in priorities reflects a desire for generativity, or the desire to leave a legacy to the next generation by guiding the next generation, passing along social values and skills, and generally ensuring the continuation of society and trying to make it better in some way. So he described this period of middle adulthood as trying to make a contribution to the well-being of others, and giving this sort of it's a more selfless stage of development where it's not about forming one's personal identity or thinking about intimacy in one's personal relationships. It's a stage of really giving to others. But the kind of flip side for this stage is the idea of stagnation. And stagnation has a stuck quality where someone is not giving back, doesn't have a sense of giving back to others, where they're placing their own comfort and security above taking care of others, for example, or really having a kind of self-focus, so being self-centered or self-indulgent or self-absorbed, and not having a concern with others, particularly young people, and not necessarily showing a lot of desire to contribute to the general well-being. So the idea of this stage is that it's a time when people are often caring for others, they're often caring for their children, they're often caring for parents, and they're often contributing in some way through work when they have meaningful work where they're able to contribute to others. So we're going to explore these different concepts of work and caring in middle adulthood and through relationships, and how this connects to the idea of generativity. So to elaborate on the idea of generativity, again, generativity is to show concern for the next generation or concern for the well-being of others. And it's part of developing one's identity around constructing a life story or a narrative around having meaning in one's life. And Erikson talked about 2 ways that people typically will express or develop generativity in their lives. One frequent way is by having and raising children, as well as contributing to the well-being of grandchildren. And then another way is through career. So Erikson considered certain types of occupations like teaching, writing, invention, the arts and sciences, social activism, and other types of professions and roles, occupational roles, that contribute to the well-being of others as being a way of expressing generativity as well. So in terms of understanding what makes someone generative or not, there's some research that's been done by Dan McAdams, who we've talked about before, about how people think about their lives and how their life stories and how they construct those influence their identities. And so we talked about that in week 2. We did a short reading about how people tell their lives. Your reader also describes his work. And basically what he does is use the life story interview, which is a particular interview method, set of questions, to ask people to describe their high point, their low point, and their turning point in their lives. And he's found that there's a group of people that he describes as generative adults and they were typically interviewed in middle adulthood, who look on their lives and see that, when they've experienced challenges and difficulties, that, they've tended to look at the positives and they've identified, ways that they've overcome challenges, and pointed to kind of redemption that's come from difficult experiences. And he describes this as a kind of mental resilience that helps people to face challenges. So basically, according to him and to other research, that the idea of resilience, which we talked about before, is a resource for people that helps them handle stress and also helps them in terms of interpretation of difficult experiences. And so, according to this idea of generativity in adulthood, those who enter midlife with high mental resilience are more likely to experience stress during midlife as an opportunity for change and growth, see the positives from it, versus those with lower mental resilience who are more likely to have negative attributions and more likely to experience what Erikson calls stagnation. So the personality resources that people bring, the aspects of self around resilience, have a lot to do with how people construct their lives related to this theme of generativity. So Adams, with his research on how people tell their life story, has come up with a model of generativity for those adults that he describes as generative adults who, have this sense of their own background where they're, seeing redemption and overcoming challenges, and then looking to the future where they ascribe meaning and want to help others and have concern for the future generation. So, he describes a number of complex factors that relate to whether someone has generativity in terms of concern for the next generation as well as action on behalf of the next generation. And he makes a distinction between those. So, how people feel and the concern they have for others and for the next generation, and then what they do on behalf of that concern if they have generative behavior, which, as your reader describes, things like, saving up and helping to pay for the education of one's child, or, supporting, let's say, charities, or making some kind of life commitment in terms of a career where you're trying to offer something to the next generation. Those would all be actions, and concern would be having concern for the next generation, which can translate to action or not. So the concern, for example, that grandparents can have for the well-being of their grandchildren. So there are a number of different things that relate in terms of motivation, thoughts and plans, and meaning people attribute in terms of their lives. And research has shown actually that this idea of generativity, that people are seeking to give back to others, actually really is fairly universal in terms of the research that we have. So it does seem to generalize across ethnic groups. So there's research looking at people in China, in Costa Rica, Cameroon, Germany, and this model of generativity also fit in those countries as well as Western countries. And then in terms of generativity, there's also research that builds on McAdams and again uses this concept from Erikson that shows that generativity is important in terms of people's emotional and physical well-being. So that shows a lot of support for Erikson's theory that actually if you use measures that try to measure generativity, they show a good association with people's emotional state and their satisfaction with life and their work and their physical health. So this supports Erikson's contention that generativity is important in middle age, and it's a good piece of information to know for those of you who are planning professions where you're working towards the well-being of others. So things like social work, psychology, public health, and some of the other fields for the BSS. It's going to serve you well, apparently, in midlife, where at this point you may not be so focused on others because you're developing your own identities and developing relationships with others. But at a certain point in middle life, people really start to have concern for others and for the well-being of future generations. So committing to a career path where you can do that is a positive thing. So there is evidence for Erikson's contention that priorities change in middle life with people seeking to give to others, and particularly to the younger generation. But is there evidence for a midlife crisis? So you probably have heard about this idea of midlife crisis. There are stereotypes of, the man in his 40s or 50s who goes out and gets the red sports car and a much younger, wife, and it's often men who are the focus of the midlife crisis stereotypes. So the idea of midlife crisis, there have been various theorists who've talked about this. So Carl Jung talked about transitions in middle life, and then Levinson, who wrote a book about adulthood, proposed a stage theory of adulthood where people experience different periods of building the structure of their life and then questioning, what they have in their lives, and that there's a transition period from around 40 to 45, which is particularly key, which came to be known as the midlife crisis. So this was a theory, but there's not been a lot of support for that actually in terms of research. So there doesn't seem to be a universal experience of midlife crisis. When people do various kinds of research studies, surveys, and interviews, there's not evidence that there's a particular time where people are more prone to crisis or to making serious changes in their lives. And when people do experience a kind of crisis where they make major changes in their life, there's likely to be in their 30s or some other stage rather than this midlife crisis period from 40 to 45. So there's very little evidence that that's a particular time for crisis, or that indeed people have a crisis where they change things up a lot. But there is some evidence in this idea of a midlife correction. So people often will go through some thinking about their roles and their dreams and how the two relate. So we've talked about this before, and your reader has talked about the idea of the real and ideal self. And often in midlife, it seems that people go through a process of thinking about what they wanted for their lives and what they've achieved and where they're at, and if it is what they hoped for, and bring their real and possible selves into closer alignment, and then sometimes make changes based on deciding that they really aren't happy in a particular career or in a particular relationship, and then make corrections. But the idea of a normative crisis that people go through, particularly with the stereotypes that we think of, there's not a lot of evidence for that. So you may recall back to week 1 when we talked about some different themes of human development, and one of the themes is around the idea of gains and losses. So one way that may be productive to think about midlife is that, like other times in life, it's a time of gains and losses. So there are ways in which people at midlife are at their peak in certain things. So they're often at their peak in terms of their careers, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, in terms of their own feelings of personal competence, the ability to handle stress. Mental resilience can be very high, sense of personal control, and their purpose in life and social responsibility. All of these things tend to be very high for people in midlife when they've established career or established family, and are becoming more comfortable with the roles that they have. But at the same time, there are also changes that are going on where people's physical abilities are changing from, in terms of their physical health. It may be slowing down a little bit in terms of their energy. Women's fertility changes, so that can influence their options and the ways they think about themselves. And then physical appearance changes as well. So again, midlife is not necessarily a time of crisis, but it's a time of gains and losses like other periods of human development. And now we're going to talk about changes that occur during midlife normatively, in terms of occupation and also in terms of other important relationships.